For 6 days they had been traveling through the deep forest, having long since left the meadows of Havala behind. Sep had decided it was too dangerous for them to take the road passing through the cities of the lowlands. There men vied for the traveler's body and his goods, and it was the rare caravan that passed through without loss of life or property. Instead, he drew upon his splendid memory to find a trail through the hills, used years before by his forefathers. He sent with them Reuben, his best scout. Even so, it'd be a challenging journey. And now Nathan and Reuben rode ahead, ever alert, sweeping the forest with cautious, searching eyes. Abigail and Shania followed, and behind them rode 4 men servants, tall and strong as oaks, for their protection. A few beasts of burden, loaded with supplies, straggled in their wake. "Only 8 of us against this danger," Shania had said as they mounted their horses the first morning. 9, Abigail corrected. "God goes before and in our midst of us. Never forget that." The entire clan had gathered about them, and Sep had prayed solemnly for their safety and for the success of their mission. Now the towering trees had given way at last to a clearing, and they followed the sandy shores of a long lake. Sunlight shimmered through the clear green water to glint on pebbles of gold far below. Shania begged her father to stop and make camp in this place of light and wonder. They had pushed at a hard pace, so Nathan, knowing his mother needed time to prepare for Sabbath, called a halt. A long, lithe lion strode along the shoreline, his muscles rippling beneath his golden hide. Shania's heart hammered in her chest, but the beast turned away from them and headed into the underbrush. Nathan, erecting the small tent in which Shania and Abigail slept, sensed the fear in his daughter. Here, where men seldom come, they simply keep their distance. It's only where they've been hunted and killed they become vicious. After they had all enjoyed a refreshing swim, the men stretched out upon the sand, letting the sun bake into their tired bodies. Shania and Abigail sat on a flat ledge, dangling their feet in the water and attempting to identify the exotic flowers blooming about them. Twirling a shaggy yellow blossom in one hand, the girl gathered the courage and blurted out, "Why did Grandfather burn the lamb?" The woman smiled, sunlight playing across her strong, tanned features. "I wondered if your father had explained that to you. It's indeed a strange act if you don't know its meaning. Remember, I told you about the promised one. Well, Seth said he must die. He must shed his blood for our sins. It's all a great mystery, but God wants us to take it seriously, to be aware of the terrible price of sin. So he has instructed us to kill a sheep, a perfect sheep, because it represents the one who must die, and to burn it on the altar. Each time we know it is our sin that brings death to the innocent lamb, but far worse, to the one who comes. Your grandfather offered the lamb for our encampment every 6th day at sundown, when the Sabbath begins. Even though I have seen him do it hundreds of times, my heart yet stands still at the awful act and its significance. Did it cover my sins too, the lamb that grandfather killed? Or only those of you who are followers of God? When the promised one comes, Shania, he will die for all. Some will accept his sacrifice, and some will scoff and deny him. If you believe and obey, it is for you. I have another question for you, grandmother. Shania sloshed her feet idly in the warm, clear water. I do not understand Sabbath. Why is the 7th day any different from the rest? Has your father told you nothing? In your home, is there no reverence for Sabbath? Abigail looked at her in astonishment. Knowing the sorrow she inflicted, the girl shook her head. Her grandmother sighed heavily. When God finished creating the earth, my child, all this beauty here before us, He liked what He had done, just as you and I looked over our gardens after a day's work and we are pleased. He'd been 6 days at His wondrous activity, and He declared the seventh a period of rest and rejoicing, a time to enjoy His new creations and for them to enjoy Him. He called it Sabbath, and He made a simple rule that we too were to rest and enjoy and rejoice on that day. No work, only fellowship with Him. That's lovely. Just lovely, Shania breathed. Oh, I wish I had known before. Why did Father never tell me? Her grandmother took her hand and they sat in the sunny silence, content in their new closeness, until at last Abigail rose and awakened a servant to start a fire. We must cook something for the tomorrow, Shania, and we shall celebrate the Sabbath here in this beautiful place. It seems Eden itself could not have been lovelier. Later in the darkness by the fire, Shania asked her father, "Why did you never speak of Sabbath and show us how to observe it?" Her father laughed bitterly. "Your mother has no patience with such acts of worship, and her sacred images would bang their silver heads together at the very thought of God's presence in that house. It's two separate worlds, little one, and in marrying your mother I made my choice. I brought you here so you could make yours." His words birthed in her, once again, a nagging uneasiness. 2 weeks later, the little party followed a wide, eager stream out of the hills and into the Valley of Eden. They had cautiously skirted an area inhabited by giants, lost their way for a period of 3 days, and seen strange, enormous beasts that could easily have trampled them into the loam of the forest floor had they been so inclined. The men cheered lustily as they left the forest behind. "Instead of making all that racket, Nathan, we might better thank the God of heaven for bringing us safely to our destination," Abigail scolded, riding up beside her son. "You are quite right, my mother." Nathan gathered the little band about him, and they prayed quietly on the green hillside with the horses knee-deep in sweet-smelling grasses. As the rim of the hills curved downward toward the valley, great white cliffs cupped an expanse of the land, shielding it completely from view. "That," Reuben spoke reverently, "is the garden." "It's huge," Shania heard the surprise in her grandmother's voice. "I always pictured it more the size of our acreage at home." "They say it's a 3-day journey to ride the length of it, and at every point the cliffs prevent entrance, except at the gates. In my boyhood, my father told me much about this valley." Reuben's eyes followed the white walls. "I never dreamed I'd have the chance to behold it with my own eyes." "Nor I," Abigail echoed softly. A large encampment, a mile or two distant, spread toward the foothills of another elevated region, and Shania guessed it to be the home of the patriarch Adam, the father of them all. They ate on the hillside, savoring the moment, hardly aware of the dry wheat rounds and the figs they consumed, each traveler busy with his own thoughts. They spoke few words. When at last they moved on, Shania rode beside her father, wishing to share the experience with him. They followed the cliffs for several hours, coming at last to a trail leading downward into the valley floor. In the growing dusk, a strange light flickered upon the dirt path, yet the sun had long since slipped behind the trees. "What is it?" Shania asked uneasily, but no one answered, for no one knew. Only as they reached level ground at the foot of the cliff could they see up ahead the most breathtaking sight any would ever experience. Before the entrance to Eden, 2 beings stood, awesome in their size and beauty. Their wings arched over a focal point between them, From it blazed a flashing, turning light, alive with the glory of God. Laying fingers of red gold fire across the darkening sky, the shadowed earth, and the trembling hearts of Nathan's little band. They slid from their horses and fell to the ground in terror. Nothing had prepared them for this sight. Was God angry at their presence? Were they trespassing upon sacred ground? Would they die? With that glory slicing into her, exposing her inner being, Shania suddenly recoiled from the selfishness she sensed there. Every petulant or dishonest word she had ever spoken now shouted in her memory. For the first time she knew every vice of which she was capable. She was sin itself. During what seemed an eternity, she wept into the black fertile earth of Eden Valley until she felt a hand upon her shoulder, gently lifting her, turning her away from the light. Come, child, you won't die. At least, not now. Not from this light. The voice urged the others to their feet and led them, stumbling like blind men, some distance from the angels in the soul-searing glory. What is it? Shania voiced again the question she had asked earlier upon the path. It's the presence of God guarding the gate, the woman said quietly, as though she had repeated it 1,000 times before. Only then did Shania look at her and know instantly that she was Eve, the mother of mankind, or the betrayer of mankind, as Ona liked to call her. Shania had expected a bent and wrinkled old crone, but what she saw was an ageless face, startling in its beauty, heart-wrenching in its sorrow, yet at the same time glowing with a steady peace. She could have stared at it forever. Nathan spoke in his gentle way. Thank you for coming to us. It's a very frightening experience to stumble upon that grand splendor. You must be Eve. We have traveled many miles to view the garden and to meet you and Adam. We did not mean to inconvenience you. Eve laughed, and the sound was silvery, like a small waterfall in moonlight. Can you imagine how many terrified people I've dragged away from that spot? Though not many anymore. The scorners are busy with their evil schemes, and the worshippers grow few. Feel free to spend the night anywhere in the valley. You are safe here. I brought you food. She placed a warm loaf in Abigail's hands and a bowl of lentil stew in Shania's. We watched you, Adam and I, as you skirted the walls this afternoon. Before they could express their gratitude, she had slipped into the darkness. Almost wordlessly they camped and ate as though the holy light had struck them dumb. Even now it flashed and flickered across the walls of Shania's tent, despite the fact they had pitched it some distance away from the entrance to Eden. Grandmother, she whispered softly, this is a sacred place. But Abigail slept and made no reply. Shania slipped quietly from the tent and knelt facing the light. She did not know why she did so, and even the day before she thought of doing so would have surprised her. But now it seemed to be the right thing to do. Words rushed to her lips. Almighty God, she said, I am a sinner. I realize that now. I share in the rebellion of my race, but I believe in the promised one. Somehow I know you will speak to me. Teach me what you desire of me. When the morning sun gilded the valley, creeping over the pastures and the fields of Adam and Seth's extended properties, the light did not seem so menacing. Soon after breakfast, Shania was begging to visit Adam's encampment. You can't just go and stare at them like curiosities, my love, Nathan cautioned. It is a little awkward unless they invite us. But she pleaded so ardently that her father succumbed, and she set off alone toward the sounds of the bleating sheep and human voices. She came upon a path bordered with shrubs and bright clumps of scarlet flowers, obviously all tended with loving care, and her eyes were riveted upon their beauty, a figure headed toward her. "Do you like them? They are Adam's favorites," the woman said cheerfully. Startled, Shania looked again into that face unparalleled in beauty, warm with kindness, and at this moment touched with a hint of humor. Before she could answer, Eve went on. "I thought you would come early, so I walked over to meet you. You have the impatience of youth, and I have sensed a heart hungry for God. Come, I want to show you Adam's gardens. My husband is eager to meet you. He does not go to the fields much anymore. There are younger ones for that. But he loves his flowers." "I can't believe I am here with you." The girl looked at her companion in awe. "Remember, Shania, is that not what your father called you? Adam and I are sinners in need of the promised one's blood. In fact, we are chief among the sinners, for we have walked and talked with God and still doubted him. Or at least I did. Do not look at me with wonder. I want you to understand before you leave the tragedy that happened here." They left the shadowed path and entered the most exquisite gardens that Shania had ever laid eyes upon. Roses, cleverly pruned and trained, bloomed everywhere against backdrops of evergreen and dark glossy shrubs. Areas of soft grass broke the profusion of color, and fountains splashed into clear pools. Shania sucked in her breath and held it. She had a wild, impossible wish that Ira might stand before her to see this wonder. A tower of a man spoke from a height well above her grandfather's. "You are a lover of beauty. It is written all over your face, my daughter. Welcome. Let me show you around." "I am his daughter," Shania thought in wonder. "Bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh." Impulsively, she laid her young cheek against his mighty arm, and he smiled with delight and gave her a warm hug. He did not look so old, but his steps were slow and deliberate, where once she knew they had been quick and sure. As he showed her each plant and spoke of its habits and needs, she heard no hint of age in his voice, only interest and enthusiasm. "You have reproduced the garden here in all its glory, haven't you?" Shania said eagerly at last. "Oh, child," he spoke hurriedly as though to dispel her error quickly. "You are mistaken. It is true I have tried, but here with the weeds and the insects to destroy, there is no comparison. Remember also," and he smiled sadly, "God created that garden. Man cannot make another like it." They sat on a bench by a pool where ruffled white irises bent above their own reflections in the water. A butterfly, purple and blue and big as Adam's broad hand, flitted from flower to flower. A question burned in Shania's mind, and nothing could have restrained her from asking it. "Last night, when I was laying before the light, I was aware of, what do you call it? Sinfulness? It was terrible. I felt unclean in the presence of that light, in the presence of God. I felt my utter inability to ever become pure enough to walk with God as his friend, the way you did in Eden. Even if the promised one dies, how will we ever again become clean and fit for his presence?" "We do not fully understand it all ourselves, Shania," Adam replied thoughtfully. "God's ways will always be a mystery to some extent, but it seems the promised one's blood pays the debt. When there is sin, death must always result. Eternal death, a terrible, total separation from God. The promised one will die that death for us, but he will do more if we allow him. He will move into our very flesh and minds until his purity becomes our purity, and we are clean once again. It is not an easy process, and it requires cooperation and submission on our part, a certain hunger for him. It is long and painful, yet joyful at the same time. We might throw away all we've gained in a moment of weakness, but we can place ourselves all over again, beaten and despairing, in his hands, and cling to his mercy. Are you brave, child? Brave enough? I don't know, Shania admitted honestly. My mother is a worshiper of images, and my father... Well, my father is a believer, but he is not brave. We will pray for you, Eve assured kindly, placing her arm about Shania. When we offer sacrifices before the light, we will pray for you. Later, Adam took them all once again around the gardens and dug bulbs for Shania and Abigail to carry home. In the evening, they sat about at a table heaped with the bounties of Adam's fields and Abigail's sacks. Carefully she had guarded the rich dried fruits and plump nuts she'd packed as gifts. As they ate, Adam spoke of the early years after they had to leave the garden. They had no tools and no knowledge, and only by trial and error had they tamed the wilderness. That was not all, Eve added, remembering. There was the taunts of others, our own flesh and blood, their anger at our failure. Our children and the grandchildren ridiculed and threatened us. Sometimes we feared for our lives. And they hated God. Perhaps that is why they began to worship gods from their own imaginations. Gods that did not hate and fear. Even that was not the worst, Adam said steadily. The death of Abel was the worst of all, but she cannot speak of it. All these hundreds of years, Shania thought as she glanced at Eve's haunted eyes, the pain is still fresh. Perhaps one never recovers from that first encounter with death. But here we are talking of sorrows when there is much to rejoice over. Adam turned the conversation briskly toward God's precious promise and the long-awaited deliverer. No matter how long we wait, he will come. Remember that, my friends. Even after I sleep in the good earth, I do not dread the end. We have known terrible pain these many years as we've watched death invade this planet. Sin has engulfed our children's children, and we have drunk the cup of guilt to its bitter dregs. Over and over we've pleaded for our descendants to humble themselves before God, only to have them laugh in our face or scream accusations at us. No, death holds no fears for us. Am I correct, my darling? Eve, smiling at him wistfully, took his hand and nodded. Shania understood that no garden, however beautiful, could ever erase the agony that they had endured, and her own heart ached in sympathy. We've tried to help our descendants understand, Eve explained, sadly, her voice a whisper, that God's sorrow over our loss exceeds our own. You can't imagine, she continued, eyes lighting, what it was like to be with him, to find him suddenly beside you in the evening, to feel the power of his presence burning into your soul before he was even visible. He took such pleasure in our excitement over each newly discovered wonder of his creation. Turning, sometimes, I'd catch the pure delight in his eyes as he watched us, and I felt cherished, safe, and content. I know the pain I have caused him all these years. Her voice broke. And the price it'll cost him. I miss him. I always miss him. And to hear him cursed and taunted, my precious friend, by my own flesh and blood, it's almost more than I can bear. If you have heeded our words, Adam comforted, placing his arms about her, but in his face Shania read such suffering as she had never seen upon a human countenance. Man born into sinfulness no longer finds the things of God appealing. It requires a long, slow, miraculous turning to bring him once more into tune with his Maker. Few will submit to that process, because it is so much easier to simply enjoy the bounties of the earth and gratify every impulse. And upon us rest the burden of this knowledge, the sordidness of man, his cruelty and his greed, all our legacy to those whom God planned so much. Nathan picked up his harp, and softly in the darkness, with the light playing over the table, the sober faces surrounding, plucked that old haunting melody from the strings. To their amazement, Eve began to sing, the story of loss and sorrow flowing effortlessly from her lips. Her clear, sweet voice, trembling now and then, wove about the music like a garland of flowers. When Nathan laid down the harp, there was only the sound of weeping, and Shania knew it was from Eve herself, whence the song had sprung.